encore être en retard, et donc je propose qu'on essaye de rester dans cette bonne voie. Donc bonjour à tous, je suis évidemment très heureux de présider cette séance consacrée au courant droit et littérature, pour la simple et bonne raison que je crois que c'est grâce à ce courant que je travaille à Saint-Denis, puisque lorsque j'ai fait mon master en théorie du droit, où j'ai eu la chance d'avoir des professeurs dont vous avez peut-être déjà entendu parler, Yves Cartevens, Philippe Gérard, Alain Papot, Marc Panouk, Massimo Bogliotti, Jacquemin, enfin tous des noms comme ça qu'on a évoqués déjà un petit peu. J'avais eu la possibilité de faire mon mémoire sur Dostoïevski, et François avait gentiment proposé de publier mon mémoire sous forme d'article, et je pense que ça m'a aidé à mettre un pied dans la porte de Saint-Denis. Et donc je dois beaucoup à ce courant droit et littérature que je remercie, avec évidemment tout particulièrement François. Alors, droit et littérature, pourquoi est-ce que c'est évidemment très pertinent pour François Ost, puisque ça le définit finalement bien, puisqu'il est juriste et écrivain, et il suffit de consulter un peu ses ouvrages pour voir la place qu'a pu prendre ce courant dans ses écrits. Alors, pour éviter de perdre trop de temps et aller assez vite, je vais déjà introduire notre première oratrice, Ladies First, Professor Jeanne Gaakeer. I hope it's correct, more or less. I asked her how to pronounce her name, and she tried to explain to me, I'm not sure it's correct. It's interesting because the origin of her name is actually French. It was Gaakeer, which is much easier for me to say. Anyway, Professor Gaakeer holds the chair of jurisprudence, hermeneutic and narrative foundations at Erasmus University of Rotterdam. She also serves as a senior justice in the criminal law section of the Court of Appeal in The Hague, in the Netherlands. As a judge, obviously, which is the way to my heart, as a judge myself. She has written, if my information is correct, no less than 265 publications. I'm going to save you the list of them. Just maybe mention one, which I believe was your PhD, published in 1995, on translation on the spot in English, The Value of the Word, a study of the work of James Boyd White in the perspective of law and literature. And obviously, James Boyd White is a very, very important figure of this current law and literature, and you will not be surprised to hear that she's also the recipient of the James Boyd White Award, awarded by the Association for the Study of Law, Culture and Humanities in 2013. Professor Gaakeer will speak to us about the theme of reality, veracity and probability in law and literature, and you have the floor.
Cher François, mesdames et messieurs, je suis désolée, je ne parle pas très bien le français et je vais continuer en anglais. Thank you for inviting me. My topic today is that of the narrative of truth and probability in law and literature. Together with the topic of the legal imagination as promoted in law and literature, these are important topics for practical wisdom of judges and for the understanding of the psychological phenomena that are at work in law, namely cognitive dissonance, confirmation bias, and belief perseverance. And I aim to illustrate these by means of an analysis of a novel, Dark Matter, by the German jurist-philosopher Julie Zeh. This novel, Dark Matter, asks us to consider questions central to law, namely about free will and about human responsibility. Here is a connection, I suggest, to recent findings in cognitive narratology that are very important for the future of the project that we love, namely the literary legal project. And the topic of narrative as operative in how we construct the world as we know it is important precisely because narratives can become set stories, preconceived scripts that we can use to reason away whatever argument that doesn't fit our story. And when that happens in law, miscarriages of justice are the result. Now, Jacob Grimm already observed that law and literature arose from the same bed. And he noted a class of what is called in German Dichter Juristen, poets with a legal education or a law degree, which is a historical connection of law and literature that is found already in the medieval tradition. And Grimm claimed, Richter sind Dichter. Judges are finders of the right word, just like poets, Dichter, are the finders of the right word in their poetry. But both are poetai in the Greek tradition, makers. They are writers of texts and they are narrators of texts, and as judges they are narrators who themselves select the facts. And that is of course very important, because to tell a story and to follow a story is also already to reflect on the order of events. Which comes first? Which comes second? And at the end, what is the sum total? What is the narrative? And so the turn to narrative is a very important development in the field of law and literature. It epitomizes the link between human beings and their products of both law and literature as cultural artifacts. And Julie Tsay, the author of Dark Matter, is a public intellectual who has 2 law degrees to her name, and she combines her legal and literary career by commitment to the public talks, which is why I chose the topic, because she is truly interdisciplinary. The novel and her work locates itself in the field of law and literature when she says that she does not have to make a truth claim as a writer of literary works, but yet she foregrounds mimesis as representation, in the literal sense, representing what happened before, which is in the tradition of Aristotle. And you see that the representation of reality in literature that represents not our world but something resembling it is very much related to the Aristotelian idea of mimesis that ties in with cognitive aspects. And so the topic of free will, volition and human responsibility in interconnection show that it is very important for us to look into the wider system of cultural significance of law through the lens of the humanities, as François has promoted for many decades. Now, Dark Matter is the story of 2 physicists, Sebastian and Oscar. Sebastian is an experimental physicist at the University of Freiburg. Oscar works in Geneva at CERN. Sebastian believes in the many-world theory. Oscar thinks that it is a very unscientific topic. Sebastian doesn't believe in causality, and Oscar is a determinist. And yet they continue their debate and their conversations over dinner. And they disagree about one article that Sebastian wrote, namely about a murder case in which the murderer pleaded that his murder was a scientific experiment, that in another world his victim would still be alive, which is, from a point of view of criminal law, a very debatable position. Now, because Oscar is against the many-world theory, he plays a trick on Sebastian with devastating consequences. And he does so on the basis of Orwell's definition of doublethink, namely to be able to hold 2 contradictory terms in the mind at the same time, to know and not to know, to see black and white together. And so one day in Freiburg there is a scandal in the hospital. People die during surgery because of the use of an unauthorized drug. And the story goes that the anesthetist, Ralph dabbling is the person who has to, well, defend himself in a court of law. But this dabbling is also a cycling friend of Sebastian's wife. Now, what happens in the story is that Sebastian takes his son to a scout camp, and at a certain point in time when he has to stop at a petrol station and then returns to his car, he finds the car gone and the boy is gone. He gets a telephone from a lady he doesn't know, and she says, "Stay quiet, but dabbling must go. No police, no word to anyone, not even to your wife." And then what happens is that Sebastian in the novel immediately, even though he has read Orwell, constructs a reason for the phone call, saying that people know that he is jealous of dabbling because his wife is the cycling friend. And he acts quickly. He finds dabbling's address. He goes over all kinds of methods to kill him, and then decides to span a steel cable over the road, so that when dabbling comes down, cycling down the road, he is decapitated. And then when he tells his friend Oscar, Oscar says, "You must go to the police to tell about the kidnapping of your son first." And then in the story, the whole situation and the perspective from the narrative changes to the police, namely to Inspector Rita Skura and Superintendent Schilf. And they have one rule during their work: to assume the opposite of what they are thinking. So when they have an intuition, they put it aside and they think the opposite. Because coincidence is the name given to the greatest human error, as they say. Now, at that point in time in the novel, Sebastian's son comes home. He says, "I'm sorry, I haven't phoned you." And then Schilf finds out who did the killing. When Sebastian heard the woman on the telephone say, "Dabbling must go," she in fact said, "Double think must go," because Oscar was the one who kidnapped Sebastian's son in order to prove to him that he should not double think. So the command, "Double think must go," was a tragic command to destroy his own life. Now then they set a trap, and Oscar is confronted with his crime. But for me, the novel is a kind of advice to go in search of Schrödinger's cat, the physicist Schrödinger. What does this narrative of dark matter, and you know it is set in a Heideggerian dark forest of Freiburg, what does it mean? It foregrounds the legal and philosophical topic of guilt and free will. To Sebastian, freedom, and I quote, consists in being able to choose one of the many worlds in every decision. And to Oscar, there is only one universe in which you should take responsibility. So in this novel, the concept of free will is interconnected to the epistemological topic of the distinction between the object and the subject, or in terms of physics, the observer and the observed. So on the meta level, to me it is a question also of the position of our disciplines in the disciplinary spectrum. Are we rooted in the natural sciences paradigm, or do we belong to the humanities paradigm? And what is more, the topic of free will in the sense of intent, criminal intent or not, is connected to the concept of guilt and culpability. So the position that we take on this subject has consequences for our view on retribution. And that is why I say Dark Matter is a very important novel for jurists. Now, as to the free will, the question would be, what does it actually mean that we say we have a free will? For example, Sebastian's decision to kill Dabbling. What are the necessary and sufficient conditions that enable a decision to do so? And what are the consequences? And I suggest, I don't have time, only 20 minutes, to say something about it, but I suggest that this leads us to the ontological and the methodological problem of the fields of knowledge we call the humanities. Namely, must we try to understand human action, or must we try to explain it? And now Sebastian in the novel is framed in more than one way. And that is the next topic. He believes in the many worlds theory, and it causes in him a form of cognitive dissonance. He reasons away what is rational because he is unhappy with the friendship of his wife and this Ralph Dabbling. So the words "Dabbling must go" cause a cognitive dissonance, an uncomfortable tension between two conflicting views, like in the Orwell position, and he reasons away opposites and only tries to find whatever supports his existing conviction, his own hypothesis on why Dabbling must die. And that is a form of confirmation bias. He accepts information that confirms his preconceptions. He avoids contrary interpretations. And he even keeps believing what he has decided that he will believe a priori, even though other evidence occurs. And that is a form of belief perseverance. Which leads us to the question of narratives, narrative probability and plot. Julie Tsay says that the interconnection of the observer and the observed leads us to the question in philosophy and in literary theory: who observes whom? Who creates the other? And that brings us to the topic of narrative of the world as we know it. All human beings, I suggest, run the risk of falling into the pitfall of narrative becoming set stories. And if you do so in a judicial environment, it leads to applying set stories as set rules. That is why I suggest that knowledge of how narrative works is very important for jurists. Because the role of the observer in a judicial environment is taken over by the judge. The judge is the observer of what other people have done, what they have written down about it, what they plead. The judge reads the files and then decides what is legally relevant, both in terms of the facts and in terms of the legal norms, and what they mean in a specific case. So the judge constructs the legal plot comparable to the work of the literary author, which is the dimension, I think, of methodology. So what makes a text and a plot convincing? Aristotle said, a narrative not only tells us what happened, but also what is probable. And that is why we should learn from literature why things happen in a specific way by the skillful representation that the author offers. And we must do so by means of our imagination, our legal imagination and our narrative imagination. Because both in law and in literature we ask, is this world possible? Could this have happened? Are these people possible? And then what matters is narrative probability. What constitutes a good story? And narrative fidelity. Whether the stories that we experience ring true with the experience of the stories we know to be true in our own lives. So in a judicial environment, this means that narrative rationality is a form of practical wisdom, phronesis in Aristotelian terms. It recognizes a contingent world, and it recognizes the particularities of a specific practical existence. So in this way, my analysis of dark matter comes full circle. The way in which the facts of a case are narrated and the order in which they are narrated determines in a large part the outcome of a case. If an advocate forgets to mention something during his plea, it's lost, and it's lost forever. So that is why I think jurists need to develop and value narrative knowledge. And as a final point, they should be alert to signs of doublethink when it comes to interpreting legal texts. So, are we rational readers, or do we fool ourselves into irrational beliefs? That is a question inside and outside a court of law. And by way of conclusion, I offer a view by Franz Kafka, and I quote, "The right perception of any matter and a misunderstanding of the same matter do never wholly exclude each other." And that is why, ladies and gentlemen, we must foster the esprit de finesse of the humanities that François has shown us throughout his long and distinguished career. Thank you.